A blissful day to each and everyone. Welcome to our online K-12 third graduation rites in the academic year 2019-2020 at Aliaga National High School, Malasiki, Pangasinan, with this year's theme, Sulong Edikalidad, championing the nation's future. To the school's Division Office 1 of Pangasinan, headed by our school's division superintendent, Dr. Sheila Marie A. Primicias, CESO 6, I have the honor to present to you the 52 candidates for graduation for the school year 2019-2020. Beauty Care, consisting of 9 boys and 11 girls, and Computer Systems Servicing, with 18 boys and 14 girls. They have satisfactorily completed all the requirements needed under the K-12 curriculum of the Department of Education. Beauty Care. Charlie L. Cayago, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Cayago. Rodolfo M. Macaraeg Jr., son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Macaraeg Sr. Derco M. Nicolas, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Nicolas. Mark Anthony C. Orenza, son of Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Orenza. Jericho B. Pasiliao, son of Mr. and Mrs. Salvador Pasiliao. Arvin B. Pukis, son of Mr. and Mrs. Armel Pukis. Jericho P. Seguiente, son of Mr. and Mrs. Julius Seguiente. Jerome M. Soriano, son of Mr. and Mrs. Federico Soriano. Sam Neri E. Soriano, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Samson Soriano. Elma D. V. Ancheta, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Elpidio Ancheta. Riza May T. Armas, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ferdinand Armas. Criza May C. Bugarin, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Silvestre Bugarin. Rosalie Z. Kawayan, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Kawayan. Dina T. Castillo, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador Castillo. Dijeline N. Lamsen, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Lamsen. Andrea P. Mangubat, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Noel Mangubat. Missy M. Maure, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Serviliano Maure. Rika May C. Pangilinan, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Apilardo Pangilinan. Gia B. Pukis, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Larito Pukis. Nikki P. Ramos, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Simeon Ramos. Computer Systems Servicing. Adrian C. Bukirin, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Arsemio Bukirin. Jerome R. Castillo, son of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Castillo. Nico Cayabyab, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo Ramos. John Dexter S. Cayago, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Dante Cayago. Jomer T. Dorrego, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jojo Dorrego. Mark Jonas P. Makashib, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Johnny Makashib. John Alex C. Magumpara, son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Magumpara. Jenard L. Nicolas, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Nicolas. Aris P. Panuringan, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto Panuringan. John Alwin M. Ramos, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Dexter Ramos. Joshua P. Seguiente, son of Mr. and Mrs. Julius Seguiente. Son Mary E. Soriano, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Samson Soriano. Mark Lester C. Tagyam, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Calixto Tagyam. Prince Paulo C. Tamayo, son of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo Tamayo. Alan E. Tulagan, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Tulagan. Harold C. Tulagan, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ramil Tulagan. John Paul N. Vicente, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Santiago Vicente. Joel M. Villamil, son of Mr. and Mrs. Victorino Villamil. Eileen Joyce B. Bruan, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Bruan. Jennifer P. Bolataw, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Bolataw. Rinalyn P. Bolataw, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Victorio Bolataw. Rosalinda M. Bolataw, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador Bolataw. Patricia P. Cayago, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Lolita Cayago. Shekina D. Cayago, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Cayago. Jessica E. Dacasin, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pompeo Dacasin Jr. Michelle M. Gural, with high honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Enrique Gural. Laila O. Maure, with high honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Maure. Menilba Mendoza, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Annalisa Mendoza. Maria Sharon T. Orenza, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Pepito Orenza. Jensen D. V. Pereras, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juvelin Barbasan. Erica May S. Villarosa, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Marcos Villarosa Jr. Gladys May Z. Yepes, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dindo Yepes. Congratulations to all the graduates. Grade 10 Bakawan, Cyrus P. Acosta, son of Mr. and Mrs. Adrian Acosta. Belimar D. L. Andaya, son of Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Andaya. Emark B. Bugarin, son of Mr. and Mrs. Freddy Bugarin. Jordan P. Bulataw, son of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Bulataw. Melvin D. V. Castillo, son of Mr. and Mrs. Melandro Castillo. Jeric M. Cayago, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Cayago. Jomar L. Cayago, son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Cayago. Mark Regan R. Edgar, son of Mr. and Mrs. Silverio Edgar. Jomel M. Espiritu, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Espiritu. Arnel Christopher Gomez, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jacqueline Gomez. Ryzen S. Hiterosa, son of Mr. and Mrs. Hooker Hiterosa. Kenneth S. Ignas, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Ignas. Jordan P. Imbornal, son of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Imbornal. Jonathan M. Manawis, son of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino Manawis. Jonald L. Masiglat, son of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Masiglat Jr. Jimwell C. Maure, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Maure. Rick Gabriel H. Molina, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Molina. Aldan S. Nevado, son of Mr. and Mrs. Al Nevado. John Vincent I. Orenza, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Orenza. Sherwin I. Kenyano, son of Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo Kenyano. Cedric C. Torres, son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Torres. Jordan A. Tolagan, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Tolagan. Mark Angelo Velasco, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Jacinto. Maren Kim Rose Bugarin, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Kevin Ballesteros. Beverly Z. Kawayan, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Kawayan. Mirasol R. Castillo, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Castillo. Antoinette N. De Luna, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio De Luna. Regine A. Macaraug, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romel Macaraug. Joanne O. Makashub, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Makashub. Crystalline I. Manangan, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Christian Manangan. Micaela C. Manangan, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Loli Manangan. Jolina B. Martinez, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Juanito Martinez. Jasmine B. Mejia, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Pablo Mejia. Jenica R. Mejia, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Mejia. Lealyn B. Orenza, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Oliver Orenza. Laika Jane D. Pereras, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Pereiras. Angel M. Poliente, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodel Poliente. Sophia May D.C. Kenyano, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Zaldi Kenyano. Grade 10 Mahogany. John Mel S. Abando, son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnel Abando. Ken C. Alcantara, son of Mr. and Mrs. Hector Alcantara. Gerald R. Cayago, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jaime Cayago. Jefferson D. Cayago, son of Mr. and Mrs. Virgilio Cayago. Jerwin Senon, son of Mr. and Mrs. Mylene Aquino. Meggy Baltz F. Centeno, son of Mr. and Mrs. Leopoldo Centeno Jr. Emerson B. Estrada, son of Mr. and Mrs. Emmanuel Estrada. Kim Brian M. Garcia, son of Mr. and Mrs. Ernie Garcia. James B. Macaraag, son of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Macaraag. Mackie G. Macaranas, son of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Macaranas. Sherwin C. Makashub, son of Mr. and Mrs. Alex Makashub. Delther R. Matabang, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rodelio Matabang. John Ramil M. Menor, son of Mr. and Mrs. Raul Menor. Jonathan N. Nino, son of Mr. and Mrs. George Nino. Aljan C. Orenza, son of Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Orenza. Jomari D.G. Orenza, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jovito Orenza. Damel D. Pereiras, son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Pereiras. Jimboy B. Pukis, son of Mr. and Mrs. Larito Pukis. John Romar B. Ramirez, son of Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio Ramirez. J.R.A. Rosario, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Jason Rosario. Denzel L. Takud, son of Mr. and Mrs. Dovino Takud. Alvin D. Tolagan, son of Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Tolagan. Anthony L. Viray, son of Mr. and Mrs. Antonio Viray Jr. Lawrence E. Zamora, son of Mr. and Mrs. Angel Zamora. Eileen M. Bolatao, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador Bolatao. Digna T. Castillo, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dominador Castillo. Roxanne M. Castillo, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Renante Castillo. Rosalinda C. Manlansing, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roger Manlansing. Micaela M. Maure, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Federico Maure. Princess Sarah C. Maure, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Martin Maure. Regine Q. Maure, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Maure. Jessica T. Orenza, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jose Pepito Orenza. Jeremy D.G. Pangilinan, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dario Pangilinan. Jenny G. Ramirez, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Ruben Ramirez. Roma May M. Ramos, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rolando Ramos. Mary Joy M. Rejano, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. June Rejano. Mia V. Ventanilla, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo Ventanilla. Aliaga National High School's completers for the school year 2019-2020. Congratulations to all our completers.
I have the honor to present to you the Academic Excellence Awardees of Grade 7 Yakal for school year 2019-2020. Hazel P. Mangubat, with honors, daughter of Mrs. Chari Mangubat. Hannah Yvonne Tulagan, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Tulagan.
Bernadette M. Baldonado, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo Baldonado. Froiland D. Cayago, with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Pedro Cayago. Lovely O. Maore, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Maore. Jasmine M. Nicolas, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Michael Nicolas. Jade I. Orenza, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan Orenza. Daniela Mariel N. Tulagan, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Larry Boy Tulagan. Janelle L. Cayago, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Cayago. Jeneline Q. Maori, with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Maore.
Grade 11 Beauty Care Academic Excellence Awardees. Giselle B. Sanchez with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Johnny Sanchez. Keisha May N. Manawis with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Domingo Manawis. Justine D.C. Ancheta with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Mario Ancheta. Kizaya U. Panuringan with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Manuel Panuringan. Karil P. Ramos with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Simeon Ramos. Ronaline A. Bulataw with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Bulataw.
Grade 11 ICT Academic Excellence Awardees, School Year 2019-2020. Hazel Ann N. Pukis with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Jerry Pukis. Junjun T. Cayago with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Roberto Cayago. Dwenver James C. Agad with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Danilo Daniel Agad. Melanie L. Capitle with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Dionisio Capitle. Isabel P. Bulataw with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Romulo Bulataw. Angela Riza P. Cayago with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joselito Cayago. Gladys May Q. Centeno with honors, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Aurora Centeno. Pierre Paulo C. Tulagan with honors, son of Mr. and Mrs. Marisa Tulagan.
Congratulations